Hello everybody, welcome back to Reaper Minis TV. Since we've finished building the Darkspawn army for Warlord, it's time that we got into playing the game itself, and the first thing we need to do is define or talk about the playing area where we're going to play Warlord. Okay, what we have here is a pretty typical Warlord playing area. It's a 4 foot by 4 foot square, 48 inch by 48 inch, and actually what I've got set up here is a card table that's less than 4 foot square, but I've got a piece of pegboard on top of it. I picked up a 4 foot square piece of pegboard from Home Depot. You could do the same thing with MDF or plywood, pick it up at Home Depot, Lowe's, or any place like that. As you can see, I've got a piece of green felt on top of the pegboard. You could pick up something similar at Walmart or a fabric store pretty cheaply. There are also a couple of online retailers that make specialty tabletop mats for wargaming. You can check them out. But this is an easy and inexpensive way to go. Like I said, this is a pretty normal Warlord size table, 4 foot by 4 foot. You could do larger or smaller depending on if you're playing a specialty scenario or doing something like a dungeon crawl. But when you start playing Warlord, this is pretty much the size table you're going to play on. Okay, now that you have your table ready, we need to set up the battlefield because it's unlikely that your two armies are going to face each other on a completely barren prairie. Even in a desert, you're probably going to have changes in elevation. You might have an oasis. In a forest area, you're definitely going to have lots of trees, maybe a stream or a pond or something like that, and we want to represent that on the battlefield. The Warlord rulebook gives you two basic recommendations for setting up your battlefield. The first is that one player sets up all the terrain, the other player gets to pick what side they want to deploy on, and the second method involves each player rolling to see who gets to start the terrain placing. You place terrain, you have an opportunity to move or take some off of the board, and then the player that started placing gets to pick their deployment zone first. If you end up playing in any kind of Warlord tournament, the terrain on the game table is probably going to be preset. It might also have some specific rules about the terrain itself. But pretty much the best thing that I've come up with is when you're playing Warlord, set up the terrain in a way to where you would not care what side of the board you ended up deploying on. Make it a mutual decision between you and your opponent or opponents if you're playing a multiplayer game. Just be fair about it and play the game. And here's a look at what would be a pretty normal battlefield setup for Warlord. Okay, so now we're ready to jump right into the game, right? Well, almost. First thing we need to do is create what's called a draw deck. And this is going to be a common set of cards that we're going to use that is going to control our deployment, and it's also going to control the initiative or activation of your and your opponent's units throughout the game. What you're going to need to build your draw deck is a common set of playing cards, and for each army that's going to be on the table, you're going to use a different suit. For today, we'll just say that one army is going to use the spades and the other army is going to use the hearts, and for each troop in the army, so that's each unit of soldiers, or each solo, or each monster, each one of those is going to be represented by a single playing card. The specific cards are not going to be tied to a specific troop or monster or whatever. It's just that if you have 4 troops in your army, you're going to start off with 4 cards in the draw deck of your particular suit. Additionally, if any of your models have the tactician ability, you're going to be able to put another card of your suit into the draw deck. This is beneficial because with more of your cards in the deck, there's a greater chance of them coming up when you start drawing for initiative, so you have a greater likelihood of being able to go back to back if you have more of your cards in the deck. But for this example, we're just going to say that each of our 2 armies has 4 troops in it, so 4 cards each. We're going to have an 8-card draw deck. And the deployment zone for each army is going to be a 24-inch by 12-inch rectangle that butts up to the opposite ends of the battlefield that we just set up. And you can see the deployment zone in the picture that's defined by the line of dice that make a rectangle on each side of the battlefield. Also for this deployment example, we're going to use just some miniatures off my shelf. They're all Reaper miniatures, but they don't belong necessarily to any particular army that I've built. Just doing that so we can move through the actual example of deployment. Okay, you can see we now have our draw deck in the bottom half of the table, and the first thing that we turn over is a red card, a heart, and the deployment off of that is going to be a hill giant in the upper left-hand section of the deployment zone on our left-hand side. The next card we turn over in the draw deck is another heart, and so this will be another troop deployment on the left side of our battlefield. And this one is going to be a troop made up of some bugbears. And you can see I've got them positioned fairly close together. I don't have to do this. In Warlord, there isn't anything called unit coherency. You can have your units or the soldiers, elites in your units spread out however you want to on the battlefield. Now, it definitely makes more tactical sense in most situations to have them fairly close together so they can support each other. But if you had a unit that was made up of missile troops and hand-to-hand troops, you could deploy them on different parts of your deployment zone. But when it comes to activating a troop, all the members of a given troop, whether they're spread out or not, are going to activate and carry out their actions during the same time period. The next card drawn is a spade, so we're going to have a troop from the right-hand side army come down onto the table, and we have a stone giant up in the upper right-hand corner area of their deployment zone. The next card is another heart, so we're back over onto the left side, and this time we have a unit of ogres come over into their deployment zone, and the card after that is going to be a spade, and you'll see a unit of beastmen appear in the lower portion of the right-hand deployment zone. Another spade sees a frost giant deployed in the right-hand deployment zone. After that, we have a heart come up, and then we see another unit of bugbears come in behind the first one. The second unit of bugbears has an ogre mage in it, and then we have our last card in the draw deck, and it's a spade, so we see a unit of cavemen come up over on the right-hand side in their deployment zone. You'll remember that I said the troops we're using today are just for purposes to demonstrate how to deploy troops onto a battlefield in Warlord. They're not tied to any particular army I'm going to play with right now, but you also may be wondering, well, what Warlord army has cavemen in it, or a stone giant, or whatever? Well, one of the things that I like the best about Warlord is that you can use any Reaper miniatures in your army. Of course, if you're building a Revan army, let's say, and you want to use the orcs and goblins and gnolls and bugbears and what have you that are part of that army, great, that's what they're there for. But if you want to use a Revan army and you pick different Reaper miniatures to use for those troops, then great, you have that choice also. The proxy rules for Warlord are very generous. Like I said, you can use any miniature in Reaper's line at all that you want in your Warlord army. And I've done this with one of the Revan armies that I own. Instead of using the orcs and goblins, what I did is I built it around a completely different theme or set of Reaper miniatures. Instead of a hill giant, I have their T-Rex model. Instead of goblin beast riders, I have velociraptors. Instead of orcs and regular soldier type models, I have cavemen and island savages. So it's a pretty unique looking army, but it's also completely legal to use in any Warlord tournament. Okay, so now we're deployed and we're just about ready to begin the game, and the only thing we have left to take care of are any pre-battle phase actions. These would be things like if you have a model with a ranger special ability, they can take a free move action up to their ranger rating before the game actually begins. So if you have a whole bunch of guys, or even one guy, that has Ranger 6, let's say, he can take a 6-inch move before the game actually begins. Alright, next episode we're going to get into the actual game turn itself, and we'll start going through the initiative phase, the action phase, and the end phase of each turn. So we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.